actual narrative of the whole Bible. And so that narrative is more of a love story. It's a story of a marriage that fell apart because one of the partners cheated on the other partner. And the result of that is what we call failure, and the failure of the partnership. The marriage is in trouble. Sacrifice is God's way of helping to start restoration.
Welcome back to the Reology Podcast. Reology is a nonprofit ministry that is centered around rethinking, researching, and rediscovery, a process that dives deep into the depths of an intimate partnership with God through a concept Jesus initiated called ecclesia. We strive to cultivate an environment that is not only safe to question and seek, but also one that is founded on the truths of partnership, words of hope that were uttered from the lips of Jesus himself. So in this podcast, we'll question Christian tradition, we'll investigate God myths, and we'll listen to those who are stirring, questioning, and desperately seeking more of what God is doing in and around us each day.
Hey everybody, this is Scott with the Reology Podcast and Reology, of course. And that dude right over there, that's Brandon Wiseman. Hey, Brandon.
Hey, everyone.
So today we're going to talk about God and questions we have about God while we drink coffee. And this podcast typically deals with stuff that we're all kind of wondering about, maybe ideas and questions that we had from growing up as a Christian or whatever. Sometimes they come about when we just start getting a little more serious about God and we take him a little more serious. We want to go deeper. And so therefore these questions arrive. So these are a lot of questions that Brandon it's come out of his brain, and we're going to go through that today. But before we go any further, if you're watching this on YouTube, we would love for you to just like the video if you found it interesting or helpful in any way, and consider maybe subscribing. We try to do this every week. We take a break here and there, but try to put out an episode every week. And so if you want to subscribe, that'd be great as well. If you're listening to this podcast via any audio, whatever way you find the podcast, you can do the same through our channel there as well. We would greatly appreciate that. So this morning, Brandon, I've got a K-Cup from Trader Joe's. I'm going to try to get that onto the screen right there. This is a decaf coffee cup, medium roast. Robin and I, my wife and I, were into Trader Joe's the other day. I was like, hey, I'm going to get some coffee. I'm going to see what the coffee's like. And I made a huge mistake because I got the K-Cup version versus the bag of ground beans, because that's typically what I do is I grind my own beans, and I brew them in a little single Keurig cuppy deal. And so this is it. And my verdict is that it's super weak, and all I can taste is milk and chocolate.
No bueno.
So, no. And, and you've got something going on.
Yeah, well, I've got the expensive stuff today. I've got the Starbucks cold brew, which is my first time having this from there. It's okay. It's not bad. Not worth the money I paid for it, though.
Man. Do you get like flavors and stuff in it, or is it just like coffee?
It's got a little bit of half and half in it, but that's it. Yeah.
Oh, got to doctor it up, dude.
Yeah, I could, but then you got the calories to worry about.
Okay. Now this is, I don't worry about the calories, but I should. I'm getting to the point where I need to start thinking about that. All right, cool. So let's get this going here. What are we talking about today? What's the question we got going on?
The thing I've been thinking about recently is the role that sacrifice has to play throughout Scripture and throughout Christian faith, and more specifically, Jesus' sacrifice and his death and his resurrection, and why is that the mechanism through which we receive our salvation? Why does it have to be, we've got the creator of the universe speaks the universe into being. Surely he could have just spoken the words to accomplish our salvation. So why does it have to come through this idea of sacrifice? Why is that the mechanism? That's the question.
I like your thought there of why can't God just like open his mouth and like fix everything? We'll come back to that. That's a
Mm-hmm.
really good thought. That's a really good thought. So we were kind of joking about this earlier, but we need to first of all make a disclaimer for this podcast episode that we will be talking about sacrificing in blood. And if it doesn't seem totally and completely foreign to you as a 21st century American, seek counseling because something's not quite right.
We're not going to do any
Because
sacrifices on this episode.
no, not today.
Okay.
Not today. We've already sacrificed. Well, I'm sacrificing my taste buds for this coffee. But other than that, and you sacrificed your wallet
Yes.
for your coffee for today. Other than that, no. It does seem completely foreign. It should seem very, very foreign and weird and barbaric and archaic and, you know, as we're joking, you know, vampiristic, you know, with the blood, the whole blood deal. It does seem strange and odd, but it is equal to what we definitely have felt as a society and a culture, almost like folklore kind of feel of what, you know, gods typically need. And there's always been this idea that, you know, the gods, it's all sacrifice is always a part of like ritualistic, you know, connection with the gods, you know, lowercase g, right? And there's that, and so sacrifice is a part of that, and it's this idea that the gods are mad, but they're not too mad, not yet, but they're getting madder. And as we joked earlier too, I keep saying we joked earlier because to be transparent with you, we recorded about 10 minutes of this podcast episode, and Brandon finally stopped and said, something's wrong with your microphone because you sound like a chipmunk. And
Yeah.
I thought if we kept going, you would drive up here to Indiana and kill me, sacrifice me. And I probably would have. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So we were talking about like King Kong, right? And the movie King Kong, where the villagers are all scared to death that King Kong's going to come and kill every one of them. So in order to save the many, we've got to sacrifice the few or the one. So we got to go get a virgin, send her out there and appease Kong so that he doesn't kill all of us. And we got to do that from time to time. And that's the mentality of sacrifice. So I felt like it's important to kind of talk about the two perceived narratives. And the first perceived narrative is the one that our culture has accepted as the truth for a long time here in America, at least. And that narrative is that we've all sinned and fallen short, right? So we've all sinned. And in that idea or mentality is that we've all done bad stuff. We've done evil, bad, horrible things against God. We've disobeyed God. We've done things bad. We have sinned against God. And so because of that, then there's a price to pay, and the price to pay is hell. And so we do these sacrifices, and it keeps us out of hell.
Yeah.
Until
I think John says Jesus is the propitiation for our sin.
the propitiation, yeah, and we'll get to that too. Yes, and you know, definitely Paul loves the whole courtroom kind of stuff, right? Too. Yeah. So Paul does the same kind of deal. So then in that narrative, Jesus then comes and he pays the price in full, so that it covers all of the sins, all the things we've done against God. It covers all of those. He pays the price for us, and now we don't get sent to hell, and we get to go to live with him in heaven. And that's the narrative that I grew up on. I think you grew up on. I think most people who are listening to this podcast grew up on. And we are just now starting to realize that narrative is not really quite in line with the overarching actual narrative of the whole Bible. And so that narrative is more of a love story. It's a story of a marriage that fell apart because one of the partners cheated on the other partner. And the result of that is what we call failure. and the failure of the partnership. The marriage is in trouble. Sacrifice is God's way of helping to start restoration, but it's actually more of a band-aid to heal things. And Jesus then comes, and his death is the completion of God coming all the way and providing a cure. So that's the narrative we're going to talk about. Sacrifice is a band-aid. Jesus is the cure. And because we do talk about salvation, and you and I have already talked about idea of salvation. We want to use salvation a lot, and that's fine, but this type of salvation is in a different mindset, because if we're not careful, we can slip right back into narrative number one, that we've done all these things against God. We're going to hell. We're on our way to hell, and Jesus is going to come and save us from hell like Superman, as we've already said. That's not the narrative, and that's not what salvation means. And as we've said before, salvation is more along the lines of healing and bringing someone, who is dying, helping them completely, heal and being restored to health. And so that's the narrative that we want to talk about and try to really stay away from the old narrative that seemed right, but just wasn't. So, one thing that I learned a couple of years ago, and I don't know why, I just completely spaced it on this, but we typically focus on sacrifices and all that stuff, those ritual type of things. We typically focus more on Leviticus, of when these things started and stuff. And reality is that's not true. More of a system came about through Leviticus, sacrificial system. But in actuality, if we read Genesis chapter 3, we see that right after the fall, that Adam and Eve are hiding from God, and God looks for them and calls out for them, and they come out, and he wants to know why they were hiding. And they say, well, we were afraid because we were naked.
Yep.
That's key. We were afraid because we were naked. And God says, who told you were naked? And he realizes what is done. He already knows what's done. But,
yeah.
And so,
by the way, I recently heard a pretty cool thing about that terminology in the Bible. I don't know if you've heard this before, but the word for naked in Hebrew, as I understand it, is arum. And it sounds phonetically similar to the word used to describe the serpent as shrewd. Apparently, it's a similar word or it sounds similar in the Hebrew language to the word for shrewd. So shrewd and naked. And some have postulated that the reason the author of Genesis is doing that is to try and put on parallel kind of the snake and the humans in that situation, and trying to make us understand that humans can play the role of the serpent in the story when we are going against God's will and stuff like that. We are acting in our beastly instincts when we are not doing God's will. And so it's kind of putting us on parallel. So that's kind of an aside, but
was that Bema?
It was, yeah.
It was nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
I like it. Yeah. I think, the cool thing about the Bema podcast, specifically when they're teaching the early parts of the Bible, is the difference between humanity being created and the rest of the creatures.
Yeah.
And that in doing that, yes, it's like it's almost like the sinful nature that Paul talks about over and over and over.
It is, yeah.
Sinful nature. And it's become, you've created something new that wasn't meant to be.
Yeah.
The whole naked part of that, they were already naked. We already know that.
Right.
But they're aware that they're naked for the first time.
Yeah.
And
they originally weren't ashamed of being naked, but now all of a sudden they are ashamed.
Yeah. Shame was not a part of the equation, and now it is. And so what does God do then to help rectify the situation?
He gives them coverings.
Yeah. From what?
Well, at first, so they cover themselves with leaves or,
They cover themselves.
but then he fashions them coverings out of animal skin.
Right. There's your first sacrifice.
There it is.
There it is. So God sacrificed some poor animal to cover
Yeah.
the shame of failure. There's your first Band-Aid, if you will. It's not natural. It's not a part of the blueprint. But now this is what we got. And God understands that things have been broken and failure has come along upon the scene. And with failure comes death, which, we have a video called Death is Not Natural. If you're watching this for the first time or listening for the first time, I encourage you to go on YouTube and check out that video. I'm gonna plug a couple videos here, but anyway, it's because we've already kind of done. We already talked about some of this stuff, but death is not natural, so death comes a part of that. So now death, not just like Cain or Adam and Eve's death, but now other things have to die because of this whole thing. In order to cover shame, now something has to die in order to cover shame. So not only is Genesis very potentially literal here,
Yeah.
but as we've said before, it's also completely metaphorical and symbolic. This is God, and God does this so much. Jesus like continued it in his life, but God is like so good at foreshadowing, and we don't really understand it. Just like the people who he foreshadowed to didn't understand at the time until we do a deep dive. But this is a definite foreshadowing of the new process of, as you said, the new mechanics, right? Of this is how it has to be.
Yeah.
You had a previous mechanic. The previous mechanic was how things were created to function, how they're supposed to function. The ideal blueprint of how our true identity and our true who we are as humanity and our purpose was for partnership, as we've said so many times. We are partners with God with us. And so in order for, this weird thing called humanity and then God, these two very, very different things, in order for them to come together, God has to create humanity in a specific way so that they can come together. Because one is unique. They're both very unique, but one is unique and pure, and one is not. One is the creator and one is the created. And so, but God has to uniquely form this relationship so that it works, so that God with us. Now, in order for God to be with us, because now death has come in, and death is not natural. It was not part of the blueprint. So now we've Adam and Eve, because of what they did, they allowed a new ingredient to come in that did not make things function right. It's like baking a cake, and you putting an ingredient in, it does not let the cake to rise. So then God has to then put in another ingredient to counteract that other ingredient.
Yeah. Because one thing he could have done is just throw the whole thing out, right? But
could have.
Instead, what he chooses to do time and time again throughout the biblical story is to work with the situation that we have given him and figure out a new way forward, which in your example is putting new ingredients in to counteract the mess that we created of it.
Yes. And it goes back to exactly what we've said before about this narrative. God is not like King Kong or the other gods. He's not motivated by hate.
Yeah.
He's not driven by his emotions. He's driven by love. That's his core, and his, at the very center of his DNA is love. So everything that he may feel emotion and he may get angry, but anger does not dictate his actions. Love does. And so even as we've said before, like looks kind of like the flood. God came in and restarted, and they're like, I'm wiping it all out. I'm going to kill everything off, and I'm going to restart and create from new. No, he did not do that either. He could have, like you said, he definitely could have, but he didn't. He because of love, and even that wasn't like perfect. Noah spent all that time on, you know, God helping him build this ark, brought all these animals to him, spends all this time, on the ark, gets off the ark and gets drunk.
We have another nakedness story.
I mean, there's
And
another
then
naked,
and then a sacrifice right off after he gets out of,
another
out of the ark.
sacrifice. Exactly. Exactly. And so, Noah sacrificed. Well, first of all, Cain and Abel sacrificed. They have sacrifices. That's what started the whole downfall of,
Yep.
the first murder, right? There's the first murder. Abraham sacrifices. Isaac is asked, to sacrifice as well. Jacob sacrificed. So there's a whole family here, the partnership family that God has introduced this idea of covering. And we know that term, the technical term, or the kind of the religious term is atonement. And that kind of like keeps things like temporarily, it keeps things in alignment, temporary alignment. It's just a band-aid.
Yeah.
So then we have, as we said, Leviticus, like specifically 16 and 17, where, God's then going over the whole, hey, here's what we're going to do. And we're going to set up a tabernacle and yada, yada. We're going to do all this stuff. And this is with a new people, as we've said before as well. This is post Exodus. So all these people, they've been living in Egypt for decades and decades, probably centuries actually. So they don't know God. They have no clue about the covering sacrificial system, the mechanic anymore. They have no idea about this. And so then God has to use Moses to say, like, it's time to teach these people. We're trying to, here's God coming back again in love, right? Come back in love, and I'm gonna help you understand how this works. I want to be with you, but I can't be with you as you are. So there are some things you're going to have to do in order to cover the situation, the shame, and create a bridge. And I'm going to create the covering for you. You just have to follow the plan here. And it is kind of a weird deal. We also have a video on YouTube called Yom Kippur, and the subtitle is Blood is Life. And if you're listening to this or watching this, I would definitely recommend you go and watch that as well. It goes into a little more detail about Yom Kippur,
Yeah.
and about the full event, which is a 10-day event called Rosh Hashanah, which literally is just about getting right with God. So this whole thing is something that happened once a year. The biggest event in a Hebrew culture, Hebrew life, is Rosh Hashanah, 10 days to getting our marriage straightened out with God. And it's almost like we're gonna renew our vows, kind of, right? And we're gonna do this once a year, and we're gonna cease doing some of the dumb things that we do that get us into trouble. We're gonna stop doing some of those things. We're just gonna focus on God, and all that culminates into the very last day, which is Yom Kippur, or AKA Yom Kippur, basically means day of. There's the word atonement.
Yeah.
Covering. How do we have God with us again? And so there's all kinds of little sacrifices that happen. There's a ritual, that involves a bull and two goats and a ram, and there's like the high priest, washes himself, in a ceremonially purifies himself using water, cleanses himself from head to foot. He wears all white, specific special garments to do that. And then he goes then to do the sacrifices he's supposed to do. And he takes the bull, for instance, he has to prepare all this stuff. This is where it gets kind of weird and strange, but he kills this bull. And this is supposed to be his specific sacrifice to God. And he kills it and gets all the blood out of it. And he goes and he sprinkles the whole tabernacle down with this blood. He sprinkles it on like all the different pieces in the tabernacle
Hmm.
and all that jazz. And then when he's done all that, this is all preparing to go into the Holy of Holies, which is where God's presence would actually come and sit on the Ark of the Covenant. I won't go all the way into detail. You can watch the video. Basically, though, all of this is to cover shame,
Yeah.
all of it. And unfortunately, something has to die in order for this to happen. And God instituted this as the system.
Yeah.
And the reason why I think that God doesn't just open his mouth and
Hmm.
fix things is because we're not beasts. We're
Yeah.
not meant to be beasts. We're meant to be something different. And we are meant to be partners with God. And so therefore, I mean, if we just like took my life, if I cheated on my wife, I just don't go and say, I'm so sorry. And she goes, yeah, no problem.
Prove it.
What do you want for dinner? She doesn't do
Yeah.
that. She doesn't do that. She says, you know what? We need counseling.
Yeah.
We're going to have to go through the trenches to get this thing back to where it needs to be. And it's going to be a lot of hard work because this is not a situation between two inanimate objects. This is a
Yeah.
relationship. And God doesn't want us to want him because he tells us to do that. He wants us to be partners because we actually want to. And that's the whole idea of like, having free will and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah. So therefore, these people have to go and do these weird things in order to just be able to have God around. God wants to be with us. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
But he can't because of failure and death. And so therefore there has to be a bridge that's built every time. And for these guys, the bridge was every year they would build this bridge
Yeah.
and rebuild the bridge. It's a temporary bridge. And we have to go through this whole thing and put on a new band-aid.
This is probably too deep into the weeds, but I
Oh no, I love it. My ears
I,
just
I,
went up.
I listened to a long conversation. I think it was a Bible Project podcast or something, and it was about Yom Kippur, and it was about Passover, and it was them walking through because, as you said, Yom Kippur is Day of Atonement, and you would think that if Jesus is going to pick a Jewish celebration that he would want to liken his death and resurrection to, it would be Yom Kippur. He is going to be the atoning sacrifice for our sins. But instead, he associates his death and resurrection with Passover, which, as I understand it, is not. There's different types of sacrifices, as I understand it, in ancient Jewish culture. But Passover was not an atonement sacrifice; it was a protection. If anybody knows the story of Passover, it's a celebration of God's protection through Passover. So the question was, why would he associate it with not the Day of Atonement? In other words, what he's accomplishing is not to be viewed so much as an atonement, more so a God's protection, similar to how Passover was played out. So I don't know. I just thought it was an interesting discussion between the distinctions between those two celebrations.
What was their final?
That's a good question. I don't know that I completely understood the entire discourse clearly, but there was a reason for that Tim Mackey explained as to why he thought Jesus chose to associate what he was doing with Passover rather than Yom Kippur, but I'm just not smart enough to articulate it.
Well, I think so. How I've been taught recently, and you just keep watching or listening or whatever to Bema,
Yeah.
because from what he teaches, the Exodus story is something that happens over and over and over and over.
Yeah.
It's a repeat story that happens with humanity and God over and over and over. And I think that probably would have been more of a culturally
Yeah.
relevant thing to tie to
Yeah.
than Yom Kippur
Yeah. I
because
think I think you're right now that I think about it. Yeah, because
yeah,
you're right. The Exodus story plays out at the micro level in the actual story of the Exodus, but
yep,
then we zoom out, and now with Jesus, we're talking about the macro version of the Exodus, where we
yes,
are enslaved to sin, not rather than
exactly,
Pharaoh, and
yep,
then we are baptized through our baptism in Christ, and then he leads us. He's the new Moses. He leads us into Exodus
yep,
out of our slavery and into the wilderness, which we're in now. We've had I think one of our last podcast episodes was about this time period between Jesus's resurrection and the promised land.
hmm
That could be viewed as the wilderness period in the macro Exodus story. We're in the wilderness period,
absolutely,
and then we're
sure,
ultimately heading to the promised land. So, yeah,
right.
I think that was now that you've said that, I think that was the conclusion of the Bible Project podcast I was listening to.
Yeah, I think Rosh Hashanah is obviously it's a I don't want to say the word festival, but kind of like a festival that
Mhm.
was very, very important to them, but not as foundational
Yeah,
as the Exodus was, because this is once a year. And if you just think of like the idea of once a year, why would God want them to do this once a year? And it's because they would need to do this once a year.
yeah,
It's like it's remembering, and trying to get them to remember. And the Exodus story really was almost like the foundation of their
yeah,
existence, really more than anything, because it is the idea of rescue and God's
yeah,
providence, right? Providing a way out. And also Jesus is real tricky too. He's real tricky because these people are hanging on to that promise as we'll get into the next episode we're going to do, which is tied to this one. Jesus is real sneaky because he knows that most Jews are thinking that Jesus will come as a chosen one to be, like you said, the new Moses
yeah.
and to lead them out of bondage again.
In a military
But
fashion against Rome.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. And so him using that is also another way to go, yes, but no, and to lead into kingdom has come and the deeper and restoring the true narrative. But yeah, I mean, because that is really kind of it. Jesus, Hebrews, and this is part of one of those shorts that we did on YouTube, but Hebrews 9, basically Paul's helping because Hebrews is written to, you know, ancestral Jews, people who
yeah,
have a long Jewish lineage. And he's basically helping them understand, that Yom Kippur was this, and now Jesus is, he
yeah,
is the sacrifice. He's not really a bull, but it's his blood does the same kind of stuff. But instead of being a band-aid, it's forever. It's completed.
yeah,
What's happened is now is like the avenue has been brought back together fully. The bridge is not made of, maybe we could look at it that way. The three pigs, right? One builds his house out of straw, one's out of, sticks, and one's out of brick.
hmm,
Those bridges through atonement and stuff like that and sacrifices are always built out of things that were not going to last. And they would require rebuilding every year. Jesus then, though, comes and builds something that will never go away. He has completely reunited the lines of communication and brought the partnership back.
yeah,
So
yeah. It seems to try and summarize, I guess, it seems like it's clearly, if I go back to the original question of why is Jesus' sacrifice the mechanism through which we're saved? It seems like it's clearly meant by Jesus to be symbolic to and symbolic to a nation who was literate in that type of symbology in a way that we as Western modern thinkers are not as literate in that type of thinking. So it's no wonder that it seems foreign to us and hard for us to grapple with because we weren't in that mindset of, but I can imagine as a Jewish person at that time, they had all of these other things in mind and they see Jesus do that. And it's probably a lot more clear to them exactly what is going on.
I would probably equate it to somebody who watches us on 4th of July.
Yeah.
And says, you go blow a bunch of crap up because you're a country.
Yeah.
Or, you know what I mean? Of course they don't understand. They were not a part of this country. We understand, even though we were not there, in the 18th century. We were not there in 1776 or what, you know what I mean? We were not, I wasn't present.
Yeah, but we spent our lives growing up learning about it, taught,
absolutely
ingrained with it. Yeah.
Right. And so this Hebrew culture is exactly the same. They have thousands of years of this history, and it's not weird to them. Matter of fact, to them, it's actually kind of beautiful because they are worshiping a different God. They're not worried that God's going to completely destroy them. They understand that there is a partnership involved here, and He is unique God. And so they understand they have a very unique situation versus all the other nations, who worship gods who just need a sacrifice so that He won't kill them. And
it's like they have these stories that they've grown up with ingrained in them, so much so that they see it, something that looks like that play out real time in front of them in Jesus's death and sacrifice, and it immediately activates in their mind the entire history that they've been growing up with, and they understand immediately what's occurring and the role that it's playing in a way that
I'm not sure they immediately understand that.
Yeah, that's true.
I think when they see him come back to life,
still struggle with it.
Then they immediately realize it.
Yeah.
But I think they thought, no, this is not the way it's supposed to go, which we will talk about in the next episode. But
but definitely more so than what it activates for us nowadays, because we see that and it just causes questions in my mind. Why is that the mechanism? So
yeah, it's foreign.
Yeah,
it's definitely foreign. And as we said, it definitely, it feels archaic and all those kinds of things. And if it doesn't, as I joked about, something's not quite right because we don't do that. We don't, we do everything we possibly can in this country to protect life and animals, even animals' rights and stuff. And so therefore it does seem really, honestly, it probably seems kind of cruel.
Yeah. PETA would probably have a problem with the sacrificial system.
That'd be bad news.
From the whole Rheology team, we hope these podcasts are encouraging and educational. Rheology exists for three main reasons: to reach, train, and equip those who want to go deeper with God in this partnership called ecclesia. If God has been stirring in your heart, where you are wondering if there's more than what you've been experiencing in today's 21st century Christianity, we'd love to connect with you, to hear your story and help you know that you are not alone. You can simply contact us via the website, rheologylife.com, or reach out via Instagram at rheology_life. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.